Good morning, everybody, and happy Earth Day. Thank you so much for showing up and coming on to have a chat. This is just intended to be a short presentation around the topic of eco-performance, and also an opportunity for us to have a conversation about arts and environment and anything else you want to chat about. I think we'll have about 25 to 30 minutes more or less of me showing some examples and covering some basics in this area. And I wanted to show several examples of video examples of artists that are doing work in what I'm calling eco-performance, and what others refer to as environmental performance, and there's a lot of other terminology. But, and I know everybody's probably pretty zoomed and phoned out, so I didn't want to do too long a presentation, but hopefully it'll be fun. And to that point, I think there's a lot of heaviness around talking about environmental issues, and it gets really serious and really and feels kind of catastrophic really quickly. So one of the exciting things about working with artists that are dealing with this topic or theme is that there's also a lot of fun, curiosity, experimentation, and wildness in it. So that's part of why I love to see what performing artists are doing in response to environmental issues, the climate crisis, and just ecology and phenomena in general. So, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about eco-performance, and eco-performance is something that I have kind of selected as a title or as a terminology because it identifies work done by artists that are usually their main discipline is the performing arts, be it dance, theater, music, multimedia, puppetry, anything like that. And they're dealing in events that are time-based. So it's live, not so dependent on visual arts or installation form. The image that you're seeing here is from a performance by an artist named Antonio Salinas, who's from Mexico, and he did a show called Polar Bear Fever that I really liked, and we presented it in Miami a few years ago. And he had this amazing costume made that you can see is the likeness of a polar bear, and he is a really athletic dancer and was doing incredible dancing in this costume and talking a little bit about, through his dance, the differences between species and how few genetic markers there really are that differentiate us from other species. And so this meditation was on the difference between a polar bear and grass. We're not going to watch Antonio's thing, but I love this picture. So what is eco-performance? As I mentioned, it's art that is made by people that have primary disciplines in theater, dance, or music, and anything in between. Some people use the phrase eco-theater. Others have used the term environmental performance. And I put a note here that that's not to be confused with the environmental theater that was identified by Richard Schechner, who's one of the founders of the performance studies field. But environmental performance is, I think, the closest thing to maybe what I'm calling eco-performance. There's also a terminology that's emerged, which I love, which is greenturgy, which is a version of dramaturgy. And it's related to this idea of eco-narratives. So how are we structuring the dramaturgy to be able to tell stories that often involve recounting of very long or expanded timescales of geology, or trying to discuss the whole time lapse of industrialization in human civilization. So those are some of the ways that we could think about creating a greenturgy or eco-narrative. And then there's also green theater, which is often used in reference to not only the subject matter of the theater that's being made, or the the scenic work that's being made, but also the way it's being made. So thinking about how we're making theater, are we using sustainable materials in all of our set? Are we repurposing materials to create everything that's on the stage? Are we working in buildings that are LEED certified or somehow green buildings? Are we relying on natural light sources instead of using electricity? And there are groups and theater makers that are taking this to the extreme to kind of test the boundaries of what can we really do to make theater a sustainable practice. Theater often is conventional theater takes place in a building that relies on electricity and a lot of control devices to be able to create environments for theater. So this is actually a really interesting problem for theater makers. And again, I'm using the word theater to apply to performing arts in general, some things that happen inside conventional theater environments. And there's a whole field of study right now that's looking at how to green a performing arts festival, how to make everything, you know, all of the different hiring practices and, you know, the whole field as it works have environmental justice principles embedded into it. So it's a very deep and interesting evolving field at this time. One of the things that I've looked at a lot, and this is a field that I've been involved in for some time in terms of my own research as a programmer, curator, and artist, and just talking to different artists about how they're making this work. About 10 years ago, I started working with this field of environment and the arts and really wanted to look at how performing artists were creating this work. The visual arts has been very good at creating eco arts since the 50s and 60s. This has been a movement, land arts, eco arts, and there's been a lot of very successful efforts. And performing arts has kind of come on the coattails of that. There's been less work produced by performing artists, fewer plays written, not as many operas, hardly any symphonies. And so that's something that's actually gaining a lot of steam more and more, and over the last decade, it's really grown. And in conversations and observing a lot of the work that's being made, I just wanted to point out some of the trends or some of the things that I've noticed that they hold in common. And one is this idea of performing artists really taking hard sciences as core elements in their research and doing a lot of very serious collaborations with scientists in the humanities and other social sciences, but primarily in the hard science. Another thing would be this idea of intersectional collaborations. And when I say intersectional, I mean looking at how the multiple systems of not just the sciences, but the social and environmental and climate justice areas are being considered. So it's not just looking at scientific phenomena or ecological phenomena, but really thinking about the societal structures that are being affected by climate and environmental issues. And this idea of the interface or the tension between the local and the global, and some people use the word glocal, which I love, or global, which is a fusion of those two words that kind of identifies one of the problems in what are considered or called climate narratives or the eco narratives, which is everybody wants to talk about climate change and everybody wants to break open this big thing. And what are we going to do? And it's this big problem. Well, it's a really large, abstract topic. This problem of meta systems is really hard to pack into a 90-minute play. And so how do we touch on the real problem or the climate issue that we want to discuss, but create a narrative that is based in a local, specific story that we can grasp as an audience? And so I love seeing how artists are doing that, how they are paying attention to the large meta issue and also telling really specific, relevant stories for communities or about specific problems. And then there's also, I think, one of the other dramaturgical problems for climate theater or climate performance would be, how do you present these stories without spiraling into the focus on kind of grief or loss or the problem of it? And how do you create spaces for hope and healing, and based on, kind of the traditional poetics of Aristotle, where you have the the conflict and resolution patterning through a narrative to be able to give audiences a journey of transformation. How do you do that honestly? And how do you, as an artist, how would you approach that? How are you feeling about that? What do you want to offer your audiences? And clearly, if we're just telling stories about the end of the world, we're going to lose our audiences and not be able to engage people very effectively. I wanted to look really quickly at a beautiful artist talk that Miwa Matreyek was kind enough to send us, and this was posted also on our website at ringling.org. And it's a reflection on her process and some of the motivations that she has as an artist working in this area. And many of you may know that this work was scheduled to be in the Historic Oslo Theater as part of the Art of Performance series this month. So we're really sad that that didn't happen, but we're really delighted to be able to look at this short offering by Miwa, and I'm going to play it for you.
Hi, I'm Miwa Matreyek. I'm an animator, designer, and performer based in Los Angeles. I make interdisciplinary work where I interact with my animations as a shadow silhouette from behind the screen. My new piece, Infinitely Yours, was in a large part inspired by my climate grief that I was feeling over the last few years, in terms of reading all these more recent articles about climate change and all the small and large ways that humans impact the earth. And also all the small and large ways that us personally as individuals have an impact onto it, from what we buy, the ways that we live, all the travel that I was doing as an artist, and sort of almost the helplessness that you feel about having control over it in terms of living in a modern society. If you look at the concept of Americans create 4.5 pounds of trash a day. In my piece, there's a scene where there's just trash pouring out of my body in a landfill. So what does it feel like for the 4.5 pounds of trash not to just disappear, get taken away by trucks every week, but to have it kind of have to deal with it? A lot of the images that you see are just things, from my plastic, recycling bin, basically, like the ocean plastics for the drowning scene is all stuff that I've generated, tofu containers and cups and plastic forks, things I was trying to avoid, but still kind of in the process of traveling and stuff acquired, and shot footage of that and animated it into the ocean. And I think part of the process of making this piece, and for me to think about, has been sort of having to face things that you want it to be, we had been living as if it was invisible, and having to kind of actually deal with those decisions. But also something I started to do was to collect my recycling for a month or more, so I can look at it all laid out, like what I was calling a plastic audit. And through kind of, not having it just disappear every week, and having to look at a month's worth of the choices that I made, start to reassess the different ways that I can approach my life to reduce the plastic. And for this piece, it was really interesting because I'm mixing a lot of video. 2 years ago, I went to Bakersfield for a friend's family holiday party, and there's a huge oil field there. So I had filmed some of that. So it's interesting that something that I shot 2 years ago kind of comes back into this piece. A lot of scenes around California too. There's a scene in this piece that is a river that an oil pipeline goes over, and it starts to spill and contaminate the water. and the water texture came from the LA River. So, there's a lot of things that I went out and shot specifically, but there was a lot of things that I just happened to have shot video of like months or years ago that kind of came back into this piece. So I feel like there's a lot of my own life kind of integrated into this piece too. I've been working with the shadow silhouette with my animation for over a decade now in terms of my body of work. And something that's really interesting to me about the shadow is that by stepping behind the screen, I kind of become more of a symbol of a person rather than me as a specific person in front of you. So I kind of become like a vessel for the audience to kind of be taken on a journey because I'm not specific anymore in some ways. Also, the shadow is interesting because, I'm kind of abstracted in the images. I can hold a lot of different scales of perspectives and almost consciousnesses. In some scenes or in some work, I'm like a person in the kitchen, doing something. But then also my shadow can kind of shift to encompass like somehow the consciousness of all of humanity or the biosphere or the earth itself. So I'm really interested in that kind of like shifting of consciousness and perspectives. I would really love to be able to perform this at environmental conferences and at places that have special curation around climate change, just in terms of my hope that the work can be part of the conversation, also help the conversation in a different way from what, like data and numbers might, in terms of getting under the audience's skin and kind of making it feel almost like a muscle memory from a dream.
The the things that occur to me when I see a lot of the work by these artists is that all of them want to be involved somehow in the conversation around the environment. They want to be participating in a productive way, addressing environmental issues through their work. So one of the things that Miwa brings up at the end of her talk, and I think that we may have cut through it, what was important is that she really wants to be able to show her work not only in theaters to traditional theater audiences or people that are loving performance, but she wants to be able to be involved in environmental conferences and places where other kinds of conversations are taking place, which I think is a very interesting question for us to think about. What is the usefulness of art when we're talking about things that are I think in a more simplified way are simply non-arts issues. So how are artists involved in these conversations? How are they effective advocates for environmental issues? So, I don't think any of us wants to go to a theater and to see a didactic presentation or to be lectured about recycling or something like that. And so being able to be in a space that is being where the poetics and the artistry are being privileged, but also having a skillful message embedded in it inside of a story seems to be the balance that artists are finding they need to strike. And I think that you see a large spectrum of expressions around environment. You can see things that are very strident and protest driven, and things that are extremely subtle. And different people are going to be inspired in different ways by all of these kinds of things. So the images that you saw of Miwa's work, I find to be not subtle necessarily. They're very, I think that what is being represented in the image is very clear, and it's provocative on a visceral level. But the skill of her animation and the shadow puppetry interface I find to be fascinating, and really creating a very much a dream world that is it's not it's not hitting us on the head with a bunch of data. It's a different kind of data that we're getting. And then the other thing that's I think that some artists have wrestled with is this feeling that they need to become quasi experts in the science, that they are they need to be loyal to facts in order to create their stories. So if somebody, for example, wanted to make a new opera about red tide, how much of an expert would they have to be on the subject? How much would they need to be showing the audience that they know about that? And I think a lot of artists really dive deep and become extremely well informed and versed. They work closely with scientists, oftentimes recruiting scientists to be close collaborators with them on the creation of works. And in the end, I think that a lot of people that I've talked with had said that they started at this place where they felt like they needed the science to legitimize their work. And then they often drifted away from that, being tethered to that, and that it was more important for them to be telling effective stories that had emotional resonance than it was to be so loyal to the science, because they're not scientists. If they needed to be scientists, why would we really need artists? So it's just an interesting tension that I've seen occurring between artists and science throughout the years. I'm going to go ahead and show a few more videos and talk a little bit about specific aspects of each of these artists. The next work I wanted to show you is actually more of a talk by the artist about the show. I don't know if any of you have read the work Parable of the Sower or any other works by the author Octavia Butler. And she's known as a science fiction writer and somebody who is the leader or the founder of the Afrofuturist movement. And she wrote incredible works, another prolific author. And there is a set of works, the Parable of the Sower and the Parable of the Talents, that tell a story about a not so distant future where environmental imbalances have created kind of really difficult social conditions. And she focuses on the United States as the setting of her story, and how these really, really extreme weather events and environmental conditions have affected society. So Toshi Reagan, the artist that we're looking at here, is actually the daughter of Bernice Johnson Reagan, who is a member of the gospel group Sweet Honey in the Rock, who some of you may know. And Toshi has gone on to become a star in her own right. She has a band and is a singer-songwriter, as a rock and folk artist, and has really adopted the tradition of the protest song that was very central to Sweet Honey in the Rock's work. And her and her mom basically wrote a libretto from Parable of the Sower. So if you haven't read the book, I would suggest you read the book. And if you are able to catch this work ever, it's lovely. And we're going to listen to Toshi talk about the work with her director.
Don't let your baby go, don't let your baby go to Oliver.
Parable of the Sower is a novel written by Octavia E. Butler. She wrote this book in 1993, and it takes place in our now very near future, the year 2024.
There's something about the world that Parable of the Sower describes, which is a world that is both frighteningly alien and frighteningly familiar.
To buy a house, we started to think that maybe we should get out.
Parable of the Sower is a great conversation to have right now. One of the reasons why it's a great conversation to have is how urgent the issues in the book are towards our real issues we're facing today.
Good days, how did it turn so soon? We thought we escaped, we thought we had room. We thought about the West, we thought about the South, still feeling ourselves.
The story will be told through music, through songs, using the narrative of the novel, and in support of this character that Octavia created, Lauren Alamina, a 15-year-old girl who really understands that the way her community is working is not sustainable, and that a drastic change has to happen.
What happens with Parable of the Sower happening within a theatrical space is it invites us all to participate in this story. And even though it's a dystopian fiction, even though it's a dystopian narrative that takes place in 2024, it's hard not to be in a theater with audience members going through this journey and not recognizing ourselves within this story that's only really 8 years away from us.
Don't let your baby go to I live out. When it was way more fun, way more.
The theater allows us to be participants in the story in a way that film would never allow us to be. It allows us to be shared participants in a story in a way that prose doesn't allow us to be. It allows us to be in a collective act of making in a way that virtually no other art form does.
As you enter the theater, you actually enter a now community. The people that you're in the theater with are your people. The artists on stage are your people. We're all there together, and we're all handling the issues and the information that come up through exploring this work. And you participate and witness at the same time.
The interesting thing about the parable of the sower for me is the way that it exemplifies the social aspects of climate change and the way that a lot of artists are engaging in social practice as well as the creation of their performances. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. The social implications of climate change, of course, are immense, and there's often specific scientific attention paid to the ecological phenomena or the environmental phenomenon that we need to be acknowledging. The systems, any kind of thing, again, I mentioned the red tide, or if we're looking at saltwater intrusion or coral bleaching or whatever specific phenomena is, it's clearly something that we need to pay attention to. But how does that interact with society? What is that? What are the impacts that we're having on the systems that are causing those things? And one of the things that comes up in the work of Parable of the Sower is that when the environmental stresses start to hit society, the pre-existing social issues that have been there, the racial inequity, the income disparities in the society often become exacerbated. So how are those things layered? And I think that's really going to be a much more important thing for us to look at in the future. And in a conversation I had with a friend the other day, we said, what we're calling eco-performance or eco-theater in 10 years is just going to be known as theater, because everything that we're going to be doing in the next 10 to 15 years is all going to be considered through this lens of climate, perhaps. So that's another, and just another way things will be shifting. So the image that you're looking at right now is an image that I love. And many of you may remember Jill Sigmund. She was at the Ringling a few years ago as an artist in residence, creating one of her huts. And she did a series of works. She's a choreographer, a writer, a teacher. And she engaged on a project that was about employing garbage in the construction of a series of huts that would not only be art installations and gallery spaces, but could also be performance spaces and places for community to gather. And Jill is an expert dumpster diver, and she's somebody that has gone to great lengths to acquire different kinds of waste, and her work looks at what is garbage, what is valuable, what is beauty. And when she was at the Ringling, she did an incredible job. I'm going to show a little video. It's a time-lapse video, and there's no sound to this. And she was tasked herself with collecting objects so that she could build her hut, and it was the 10th hut that she made. And she worked with the curator to go out into the city to source different materials. She worked with volunteers, the security staff on site, and asked them to bring in objects that they no longer wanted and they wanted to pass on. And so you can see how the building of this hut occurred over some days. And I wanted to read actually a passage from this beautiful book that Jill created that's an account of her hut project. And it talks a little bit about her going to the dump here in Sarasota. She says, I was very lucky to get clearance to visit one of the municipal waste transfer stations of Sarasota, where I met the sprightly Richard Amador, who showed me what happens when the garbage trucks come in from a pickup. A truck dumps 6 to 10 tons of residential waste onto the floor of the hangar-like space. Up to 3 trucks can dump at a time, forming big mountains of trash. Then the mountains get pushed off a ledge onto flatbed trucks below and make their way to the landfill. The indoor space is full of flying seagulls and white ibis, picking through the refuse with their curved red beaks. It's very Fellini. I took a Cinderella paddleboard, an orange tube, a metal flower pot, a basketball, and a rice cooker. The stench was incredible, and the guys were incredible in their vigor, enthusiasm, and warmth. When I left, one of the guys was up on top of the building. He put his hands on his heart and threw them out into the air toward me as the seagulls circled loudly overhead. And I love that passage from Jill because it exemplifies one of the things that I love about this idea of social practice, which is that the making of art isn't just about the final product and what happens once the product is made or exhibited for an audience, but it's everything that goes into the achieving of the metaphor that ends up being the piece presented, whether it's a visual installation or whether it's a performance. And part of Jill's practice, and she's expressed this when we've had conversations, is that it's really important for her, for the people that contribute to the work to be seen, to be heard, to be present. And when the hut was finished, she performed a dance at the hut and then allowed people to be part of what she calls rituals, where they can have tea, sit down, inhabit the space. And it's a very emotionally provocative experience, and it is allowing people to be participative in the space and not just have the artist be the only agent that's doing things in the work. The next piece I'm gonna, I guess we won't try and listen to this, but there's a practice called site-specific performance, which is identified kind of like the environmental performance or the environmental theater movement, which has to do with doing things that are theatrical outside of traditional theater spaces. So oftentimes a work that is called site specific is reliant on the place where it's happening. So for example, there's the work that many of you may have heard of called Sleep No More that takes place in a hotel in New York City, and it's all about what the different lives and things that are happening in the different hotel rooms. Well, the story kind of depends on it being in a hotel because that's the setting for the work, something that you really couldn't achieve in a theater. So the site specificity of that kind of performance is necessary for the full story to be told. This has happened in different places like hospitals. A lot of people have done work in jails and other facilities that were previously purposed for other things, but then became theater spaces. And a lot of environmental artists are doing site-specific work in outdoor environments that are clearly speaking to the themes of their performance. So Loup-Garou is a piece by an artist named Nick Sly. He's from Louisiana. And Loup-Garou is actually the Cajun term for werewolf, and it's the Cajun werewolf myth. And Nick Sly belongs to a collective of artists called Mondo Bizarro in Louisiana, mostly in New Orleans. And they started making a lot of work that was site specific, that was in response to the Deepwater Horizon BP oil spill that happened. And Nick is a Cajun man, and he's from he's a descendant from a lineage of families that have lived in Louisiana since colonial times. And he is really invested in telling these stories and has created quite a few beautiful pieces that take places in parks or outdoor lots. And one of the ways that he wanted to tell the story of the oil industry and the wetlands loss in Louisiana was by assuming the character of the Cajun werewolf called Loup-Garou. And so he alternately plays the werewolf, and then he also plays a man that's kind of an outcast from society and gets called Loup-Garou as a bit of an insult, and but is able to tell us the story of what has really happened on this land. And the complex, and not just the historical significance of industrialization in the Gulf Coast, but also the complex modern day relationship that a lot of the residents of Louisiana have with the oil industry, because many people enjoy great economic stability because of working for the oil industry is lucrative. So what is the trade-off for a lot of the people in these lands?
Now the truth is, they never much liked the way I ran. They've been calling me a Loup-Garou ever since I was a small child. So when they kicked me out, there wasn't much sweat off my hide. But I didn't count on the nightmares. I didn't count on the dead crawling to me every night talking about how the oil companies is carving up the land. You gotta be real close to your animal if you wanna live out here, where the land ain't safe to step on. Think like a reptile. Breathe in those dark waters. Move without making a sound. Communion with the swamp, that's your only salvation. So I hold my breath and become. We could dike out the sea. We could build new land, but we could never keep the English at bay. They came in their crimson coats, locked our men in churches, boarded our women and children on separate ships scattered down the coast, a sacrifice to Neptune.
This kind of work
Always hungry for more.
It's a different experience for audiences. You're often relying on natural light. Sometimes you can sit, sometimes you can't. You're exposed to the elements, so temperature and insects and things like that are part of your experience as an audience member. I really like Nick's work because of his commitment to making these spaces surprising and participative for audience members. In this piece, he dug a lot of holes and buried a bunch of his set elements that would be revealed during the course of the performance. And this was a solo, but they've done a couple larger group pieces. So I think this is a great example of a site-specific piece that's really a new, I wouldn't say it's not new at all, but it's something that I think is a great opportunity in a lot of artists. So seeing that doing work about the environment outside is a great way to underpin the storytelling with the perfect set, right? You couldn't ask for some better landscapes or better set design. There's clearly problems, there's noise, there's weather, but now we're in a really unusual situation where we may have to really consider how we are engaging in closed environments and gatherings. So I don't know, maybe there's something really to be learned here. Another set of performers that are close to our hearts is a group called Dancing Earth, and this was a little bit of a sneak preview because this is a group that we hope to bring in the 2021 Art of Performance season, and things have really changed for us in terms of our outlook for next season. So if we can't bring them immediately, we hope to have them in Sarasota soon. Dancing Earth is run by director Rulan Tanjin, and Rulan has created a series of works for artists that she trains and works with, and she is dedicated to training Indigenous artists, and so her work is focused on dance primarily, with a lot of theatrical and video elements. And this is a very short trailer of a work called Between Underground and Sky World. And one of the things that Rulan underscores in her teaching and her choreography is how Indigenous epistemologies, as she calls them, Indigenous knowledge systems that are often seen by non-Indigenous people to be something of the past or kind of traditions and history, are actually very much alive and could be very effective in looking at and doing problem solving for current ecological problems. So while she calls herself, I think, more of an Indigenous artist, she also acknowledges that most of her work looks at ecological issues as well. So hopefully we'll see more of Rulan when she comes. And the last artist I want to look at is an artist named Cynthia Hopkins. This is a work that's actually a little older than the rest. It was made in 2012. Cynthia Hopkins is an example of an artist that worked really closely with scientists in the creation of her work. And her work in the end kind of wasn't scientific at all, but she's a musical theater artist and plays the accordion. It's one of her main instruments, and is an extraordinary singer. And she was invited by an organization called Cape Farewell that was doing extensive research in the Arctic to study the glacier melt. And they decided at one point that they wanted to be including artists in their voyages because they realized that they were having a hard time communicating the data of their research, and they wanted to understand how to better tell their stories around their research. And so Cynthia Hopkins happened to be one of the artists they invited, and upon her return, she worked on the creation of this show, which I actually was able to see live at St. Anne's Warehouse in New York City, I think around the time that it premiered. And she incorporated a lot of film footage from the voyage. And one of the things that Cynthia was working with was this idea of how do you create metaphors for things that are so large and so abstract.
I'd set it on a mountain, and a symphony of horns would roll across.
Cynthia Hopkins is a distinctively special music theater maker. She has an innate theatrical uniqueness and power.
This show, it kind of uses as my story of coming of age and being able to address issues outside of my psychodrama as a metaphor for my species, the human race.
And I suddenly realize that alcoholism is an excellent metaphor for the climate crisis. We're addicted to behavior that is making us sick.
It is a piece called This Clement World, and it's Cynthia meditating on the state of the world and climate change and global warming. And she equates that to her own challenges around alcoholism in her earlier years.
But in the Arctic, it's impossible not to notice that we're actually lucky to have survived thus far.
Hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for the 100 years
images are stunning, and it's a very soulful and vulnerable work. So we're invited into the fragility of her own life and her own struggles, and looking at what our struggles are, how fragile the biosphere really is. So those are just some of the ways that she chose to tell her story that I thought were extremely crafty and an expert use of metaphor. And I put up a few things that would be kind of topics for discussion, and these are just suggestions. But Laura, I guess we can like open it up for questions if anybody wants to respond to these images or anything that came up while we were watching.
Elizabeth, Mia, the first artist you showed a video of, I noticed the images are particularly beautiful, apart from the message. And does she work strictly in video, or has she done other things as well?
So she's an animator by training, and she's also worked as a theater artist, and she started using the technique of the shadow silhouette and shadow puppetry. I think a kind of parallel to her training as an animator. So she creates the images, and then she appears live on stage as those images are being projected. So it's kind of her special brand of live performance, but it always comes with a video element in it.
Okay.
Elizabeth, I'll ask you a question if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I know, I mean, you're this fabulous scholar and curator of performance, but you're also an artist yourself. And I know a lot of this is very near and dear to your heart. Can you talk a little bit about your own work and share some of that thought process with us?
Sure. I worked in theater for years, and my training in dance and theater really had nothing to do at all with the environment or climate change or anything. I was very interested in dance theater and absurdist theater, and I got more involved in issues around climate and environment just kind of as was a natural evolution for me. I always tell people that I'm a card carrying tree hugger. So I grew up in a household where, you know, environmentalism was a really big deal. And it was just, I guess, inevitable that those two worlds would converge at some point. And some of the things that I pointed to were really struggles that I had around wanting to make good theater and also being tempted to give a science lecture at some point. I began with a story about the disappearance of honeybees, or the colony collapse disorder of honeybees populations, and made a very unscientific show about that, which was great fun, and relied a lot on the writings of different eco-feminist scholars and fiction writers and things like that. So that was a lot of fun. And then drifted, and I'm not trying to be funny, into a story about plastic pollution in the ocean. And then looked at a lot about how to incorporate myth into storytelling. So how can we kind of appropriate myth to apply to a more contemporary situation, and use the idea or use the functionality of myth to explain very difficult things to ourselves, and how does that work in theater. And so my particular involvement with this artistically has been not only as an artist, but also I felt really strongly about figuring out a way to apply what I do best to this issue. It's very tempting. I think I felt so strongly about the growing climate change problems, and as of course every day we read something new, and it's constantly unfolding, and you can never really be all on top of the messaging, and how do you talk about it? How do you not get fatigued by it? So, and it wasn't, so I guess it wasn't just about making my own work, but it was about how to be communicating with other artists to know how this work was being done effectively. And then I started a project in Miami, which is where I've been based before I came to Sarasota, called Climakazi, which is this idea of kind of like raising an army of artist activists that would be able to do this work. And so not so much about how to show my own performance, but how to support a network of artists that were doing this work well. And so that's one of my great loves, is to also understand how to keep that conversation going and to present the work to larger audiences, and not just audiences inside theaters, but how to bring people that wouldn't normally be in the theater into the space. Through site-specific work, through engaging with non-arts organizations to do the performances. And so, I've just met so many amazing people. It's just been such a journey and such a great joy.
All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing those great other artists and a little bit about your own story. And I guess happy Earth Day, everybody.
Happy Earth Day.
Thank you both.